And if you watched the previous episode, I was talking to you about how to set up DevOps in order to do something which is quite a tough thing to do when it comes to automating databases from one environment to the next, where you want to be able to add, let's say, a data factory as a managed identity, because every data factory has its own name, and you want to add that data factory to the SQL Server because you want your data factory to be able to read and write to your SQL Server. So we're going to also load that up for you to show you what that might look like. So I think I've loaded one of those in. Let's just go to our Azure portal quickly. And then we're going to go to I've got some infrastructure as code that's created this data factory, and I'll show you that in a minute. So what we don't do is use our infrastructure as code to create the data factory and also create our SQL Server. And then we want to add our data factory to our SQL Server as a user. And then in that way, when you create your linked servers, you'll be able to use. So normally you would come in here and you say, okay, SQL authentication or managed identity. They're always changing things, but managed identity is what you want. So it says, yeah, look, the identity name is this of your data factory, and then you've got to go and add that as a user to your SQL database. So let me show you how to do that, automated, not manually, in DevOps, so that you can do the same thing for yourself. So going to start with the database solution. So you would create yourself a DAT pack solution, and so that you would say, okay, create this database and then deploy that database from environment to environment. And that can look like anything. It doesn't need to, nothing special. Like you can have, here's a staging table, for example. Let's have a look. Just any old random tables, views, or whatever, So I've actually got 3 databases here, but I want to just talk about this database in particular, database leader. So in here, I've only got like 4 tables. And if you thought you could probably do this with a post deployment script where you said, okay, create user, maybe you want to put the data factory name in there with default schema equals DBO, and then alter the role data writer or DB owner, and add that data factory to the database using a post deployment script, then you're going to come up against an error that says that the SQL Server cannot read the directory. Right. So let's just imagine you created this thing brand new. You had a brand new SQL Server, brand new data factory, and you wanted to create it from scratch. And then you wanted to add the data factory to the SQL Server. It would not work because your brand new deployment would happen. You'd create your data factory, you'd create your SQL Server. The SQL Server then would do the post-deployment script, and then it would say, add the data factory as a user to myself, the SQL Server. That Active Directory will come back and say, sorry, Mr. SQL Server, you're not a directory. You are not a directory reader. Therefore, you cannot access the list of all the users in an Active Directory. Now, of course, you can go and make the SQL Server a directory reader and then redeploy your code, and it will work. However, it's kind of like putting chicken before the egg or cart before the horse. So, you could do that for the next environment, but then you'd have to deploy your infrastructure. It would fail on adding that in. Then you'd have to go and add the SQL Server to the directory readers because it's a new SQL Server with a new name, and then rerun it, and then it would work. So we want to avoid that. We don't want to have to do that. So I'm going to show you a way to do it. You still have your post deployment script, and obviously I'll just bash some script together. It's not like the best begin and try and end catch thing, I know, but it works. Okay, so let's say we want to create a role. Let's give it a specific role that can do select, insert, update, and it can create tables and whatever. Let's just say we want the data factory to be able to do that. I actually did this for a project and then for Synapse, so it's very similar. So now let's go to, right, so you got your database solution. You're going to build that, well, basically you're going to save it to a repository. So here's I think I've got this on, yeah, it's on GitHub. And I've saved my solution to this folder. And this folder has the solution file sitting at what level? I think it's sitting inside here. There's my solution file there. Yeah? So my solution file is there. There's my tables, and there's my post deployment script. As you can see, now I want to be able to, build this in DevOps and deploy it to my SQL Server. But first, I'm going to build my infrastructure. So here's your infrastructure here. I've got ARM templates for my SQL Server. I've got ARM templates for my data factory there. I'm going to deploy that via YAML, and then I'm going to do some stuff. So if you've been watching from the first episode, then you'll see how to set up your DevOps and your service connections and so forth. So just to run through this very quickly, I don't want to spend too long on this, but you guys are going to have to go and figure out how to do your ARM templates. But I've got some ARM templates here, which creates my SQL Server. I've got some ARM templates, which creates my data factory, just empty shells. And then I want to populate my new SQL Server with database tables and, users and stuff. And that's what we want to do. So infrastructure code is pretty simple. I'm creating a resource group as well. So from scratch, I'm creating a resource group. I create the SQL Server. I create the database, data factory. Then I want to populate, like I said, the SQL Server with a database with tables and users. Now, the way you do that is if you look at the way I've set up my YAML and such, you'll see that what we've got here is a starting stage. All right, so we've got up here some parameters. These aren't very important, but you can get some ideas about how to structure this. And then I've got some global variables. I'll show you that in a minute. And then we got, run the stage environment. So, and I'm running it, through the parameters. So it'd be dev, for example. Let's say we send the parameter dev. So it'll run the stage environment with dev. So let's go to that stage quickly. There. So now the parameter comes in, it's dev. So it's stage dev. And then it's going to go look for all the variables in dev as well. So it's going to look for the global variables, of course. And then it's going to fire that off and do the global build. It's going to do the data infrastructure and then the data build and the data services. Now, not to spend too long on this because I want to show you the crux of it, but this is going to do a build a database, as you can see there, and build the data factory. But what does build the database mean? Okay, so obviously before any of that happens, it does the data infrastructure first, which is create the empty shell of the SQL Server, create the empty shell of the data factory. That happens here when it just deploys these ARM templates. You can see the ARM template deployments there. And then the data build. Okay, let's move on to this piece now. So if I open build Azure SQL DB here, so that's a task over here. These are the deployments, by the way, of the infrastructure. Then I come here and I want to build the Visual Studio DAC pack. All right, so this is the best way to move databases from one environment to the next. So yeah, I've got a task VS build at 1, as you can see in line 8. So I'm going to build the solution. There's different ways of doing this, but this is the main one, and there's different ways you can do it over here. Now, you're basically building that anything that's in that in this repository as a solution file. That's what you're going to do, and then you're going to copy those files to basically the agent. This is the agent that we're working on, which is when I say agent, it's the DevOps virtual machine that's running this job. And then we're going to copy those files and publish them as an artifact. And you'll see how that comes together in a minute. That's the first piece. That's how you build it. The next piece is that you deploy the database, which is this task, which obviously gets done by the data services job over there. And it triggers off this one. Here is really where you're going to learn the lesson of what I'm trying to teach you here. And I'm just going to show you the PowerShell as well. So what we want to do is in our post-deployment, remember, we're building this DAC pack, and inside the DAC pack is the post-deployment script, which is just to create the database role. So we're going to create a database role. Then instead of doing create a user and add it to the database in the post-deployment script of the DAC pack, we want to not do that, okay? What we want to do is use our DevOps service connection, which if you watched the previous video, we added as a directory reader, and we created some security groups. So I created the SQL admin group, and I created the SQL Server data writers security group, right? So that's a once-off thing. You don't have to worry about that for each environment. And you can create different security groups for different levels of environments. So if I show you, let's go to the Active Directory just to recap and refresh your memory. You can see that the idea would be I would have SQL data writers test, SQL data writers PV, and then I'm going to add inside here. Now, this is what we're going to do in DevOps. we're going to add the members. We're going to add that data factory as a member to this security group, right? And then we add the security group to the role, the new role that we created in the DAC pack onto the SQL Server, okay? And so remember how this all ties together now. The DevOps service connection is a directory reader. Therefore, it can execute this script, which I'm going to show you in a second. Let's just go one piece at a time. So the DevOps service connection is going to get a token for the database. And the reason why you needed that SQL admin is because you wanted to add the DevOps service connection as a SQL admin user. And if I go to groups here, and obviously you can also have SQL admins for every environment as well, of course. So you can see I've added my DevOps. There it is, that one, Clintel Janssen Web Apps Learning. That's my actual service connection. And then if you look at this, the actual going into the server that's been created. I know this is a bit long-winded, but if you're interested, then you'll be following me. You'll see that the Active Directory has been set as this group, and I can add as many members as I want to that group, right? I could have SQL admins dev, for example, and so if I didn't want to mix production with that, then yeah, no problems. So it's going to then back to the back over here. It's going to have create a token, basically, okay? And then it's going to, if you don't have allow all Azure services ticked on for your SQL Server, then you're going to have to create yourself a PowerShell, create yourself a firewall rule. Okay, so, and if you don't know what that means, I'll just show you quickly. It's this little tick box. Go to our server. If I go to networks, yeah, there we go, networks. And I don't, well, basically, if that's not ticked, then you have to put a firewall on. If it's ticked, then you don't need to worry. Okay, that's that one piece there. So moving on, we've got our firewall open, and then we run this task called SQL Azure DAC Pack Deployment 01, Act 1. And we authenticate via connection string. We could do server name, password and such, which if you log on with a SQL account, obviously you can't add AD users when you logged in as a SQL account. Nonetheless, we're going to authenticate with connection string. So then we want to do a DAC pack, we want to do a publish, and we want to throw these additional arguments. We want to give the access token, which we got from here, and we'll put the access token in over there. And actually, these are irrelevant because we're not sending these. No, we're not actually sending this to the post deployment. This was like from a previous iteration I tried. Then think about it now. So your DAC pack's been deployed at this point, and it's done the post deployment script, which is just to create the role, the new role to the SQL Server. So let's open that quickly. We'll open our SQL Server in a minute, and then the next part is these two PowerShell things. So we have to use PowerShell for this because PowerShell is able to actually add the security group, which is an AD object, remember, is able to add that security group to the SQL Server as a user. So let's just have a look at that. So I'll just show you the results of what actually happened. So let's connect. I think that's the right one. I'll probably have to clear my firewall, but let's have a look. All right, so it's sending me a notification via my authenticator. So there it goes. And let me just clear my firewall here. That one. You can rename your firewall like that. Let's say okay. Right. Now, if you look at the database that's been deployed, and I'm going to show you the security part. So if you remember these customer table 22 table authors, if you see, there you go, customer table 22 table authors, just basic, like really basic stuff. And then users, and then roles. Let's have a look at the roles, database roles. So remember in my post-deployment script, I had this role created. So that created nicely. And then I've got this user the security group added as a user on my SQL Server, and inside that security group is the data factory that we have. So just to prove that point, let's go to our data factory and make sure that we can connect to that database. So if I go new connection, I go SQL, Azure SQL database, next, and then I want to connect to my database server, which is my test server, and I want to do that DA transactions, that one there. And then I'm going to go manage identity, right? So I want to be able to authenticate via managed identity, which is this data factory's identity to my SQL Server. Let's give it some name, blah, blah, blah. And annoyingly, you can't test your connection until you've enabled your virtual network configuration. It's a bit of a pain. Let's see if we can get by that somehow. If I enter manually, no, we don't do that. Anyway, let's wait for that to come on, and we're going to test, make sure that's all working. Going back to that, so now let's have a look at this PowerShell code that actually adds the security group to the SQL Server, right? And this can all be done automatically. Automation is your number one priority. So going into my utils, and this is where it executes it from. So you can see that my script arguments I'm sending to the PowerShell, and remember that I published actually these scripts from this folder to the agent. And if you want to see that, I think I did it over, go to my publish here. There are just DevOps tasks utils. That's under there, DevOps tasks and utils. I publish that to the agent. Okay, so then therefore it's available when I come over here. So then I'm going, okay, scripts, and then I run this PowerShell, which is that one there. Again, my PowerShell is not the best here because I know that certain things, certain errors aren't catched and caught. I'm just doing like a catch-all just for something, just so that it can run multiple times. So what it's doing is it's accepting the security group as a parameter. So which security group are we talking about, and which data factory are we talking about? So then we say, okay, it's this security group and it's this data factory. Those are the two things you got. So what's the ID now? Over here, I'm going to go get the object ID of the security group. So that'll be either SQL data writers dev, SQL data writers test, it's depending on which environment you're doing, right? And then I want to also get the ID of the data factory. So then now that I've got the object ID of the security group, I've got the object ID of the data factory, I'm going to add the data factory as a member of the security group. And that's what I do over here. So I say add Azure group AZ AD group member, and I say it's added to this security group, and this is the factory, or this is the member I want to add, which is the factory. And done. That piece is done, right? So now the next piece I want to do, the next PowerShell task, is to add the security group to the SQL Server. Right. Last piece. This is the last piece of it. So it's this piece here. Now, I got this from a website, and thanks to this guy, and I'll just open up, maybe his website will open, Christopher Derrick. So, Christopher, if you're out there, thanks a lot. This was the this piece here. If you look at this down here, it's got the code at the bottom. Here is really the code that I've used to make. I've changed it slightly, of course, because I didn't use the exact same principle as he has, but it works. So I know there's a lot to look at, but you can always pause your screen and retype it out if you want. But I did say I'm going to try and make my GitHub available for this. So if in the comments of this video, if you do find that I've put my GitHub URL, which to open up as a public repository, then you'll be good to go. So inside here, let me just show you the crux of this, is that it gets another token. I didn't know if I could actually pass the token through. So anyway, I've just created a new token. I've obviously got the object ID of the security group, right? But what's quite important here is that you have to get the SID, because you can see that when you add the SID, it's over here, line 40. You're creating a user, which remember is the security group. Okay, just to remind you again, is going back to here. This is the user I want to create there in the blue. I want to create that user, which is the security group, and the SID is this. You get it from this above code over here, and the type X is for like a service principal, and E or something is for like a normal person. Anyway, that's like built-in stuff. And I want to be able to alter the role. Remember, this is the new role that we made, and I want to add the security group as a member to that role. Okay, so therefore that security group will have read-write access and be able to create tables and do whatever it wants to do. And remember that the data factory is now part of that AD group. So there you go. It runs that script. I'm going back to my deploy over here. And then obviously I remove the firewall. Boom, done. So let's have a look at what that looks like in DevOps. I ran it successfully. There was one small thing which maybe tripped me up about these security groups was, again, this is something that you have to get the person that you're working for. Like, let's say you're working for a company and you is a consultant. There's a few things you have to set up before this can all happen, which I mentioned in my first video, which is, let's say you don't have access to create AD stuff, right? And like a lot of projects you work on, they're not going to let you mess with the AD. So all you're going to say to them is, please, can you create security groups for me? And please, can you give the DevOps service principal, the DevOps service connection, which is an app registration, which is a service principal. Okay, I know there's a lot of words there. It's in your AD. Just to reiterate, if I go to my my groups here, so you want to have this all set up by the company before you even start. If I go to app registrations here, so when you do create your service connection from DevOps, it's going to create a service principal, which is that one there. And what you want that service connection or that service principal to be able to do is two things in your directory, right? Directory reader. So you ask the company, please, can you make that a directory reader? It's going to be able to read all of the members of your Active Directory. And then you also want it to be a group, what do they call it? Group administrator. Now, there may be better ways to do this, but this is just how I found to get it to work, because some companies might not be happy for that to happen. So depending on the situation, I hope you can get around it if they say no to that. Because basically you want to be able for that DevOps service connection to add the data factory as a user to that security group, and then you want that DevOps service connection to add the security group to the SQL Server. I know it's insane, but that's it. That's the joys of trying to automate things, okay? Because you're not automating it. Remember, you want the DevOps agent to do it, but the DevOps agent has been called upon by the service connection in DevOps. So yeah, I hope that makes sense. I want to try to get this repository out to you guys. It's here. It's all here. I don't think there's anything in here that is sensitive. Of course, I don't believe. But if I just gave you this repository without explaining to you how the DevOps works, then you would probably get nowhere if you didn't have any experience. So there's one more last thing I want to show you, which is the variables, which is pretty cool. Inside the variables here is where stuff gets called from all your different jobs and tasks. So that if you didn't understand where something came from, like for example the build here or the deployment, and you thought, okay, where did these parameters come from? Then they come from the variables YAML files. But that's it from me. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you learned something new, and join me next time for the next episode.